I tried to start kick him. My kick just go to the halfway, and he fit already on my face. Like that.
He stood 3 feet away from the fastest kick in the history of cinema, and he did not blink. For decades, Sammo Hung has been asked the same question at nearly every press event, every award ceremony, every quiet dinner with old friends from the business. What was Bruce Lee actually like when the cameras stopped rolling? For years, Sammo gave polite, short answers and changed the subject. But now, in his 70s, he has started opening up in a way he never did before, and the picture he paints is nothing like the one that circulated in tabloids for 50 years. If you search for these 2 names together online, you will almost always run into the same old story. For decades, a persistent rumor claimed that Sammo Hung and Bruce Lee could not stand each other, that 2 of the biggest names in Hong Kong action cinema were secretly bitter rivals who nearly came to blows behind the scenes. Some versions of the story even claimed there was a real physical confrontation between them, with one man supposedly humiliating the other to prove who truly deserved the title of Hong Kong's top martial artist. It was the kind of story tabloids loved to print in the 1970s, when gossip about feuding action stars sold magazines by the truckload. It fit neatly into what audiences wanted to believe, that 2 larger-than-life fighters, both trained since childhood, both fiercely proud, simply could not share the same spotlight. For a long time, neither man spent much energy publicly correcting the record, and so the myth kept spreading from one generation of martial arts fans to the next, repeated so often that many people simply assumed it had to be true. But the real relationship between these 2 men, according to what Sammo has described over the years in interviews, film retrospectives, and documentaries, looks almost nothing like that old rumor. It is a much quieter story, built less on rivalry and more on mutual curiosity between 2 young men who had taken wildly different paths to get to the same film sets. To understand why their meeting mattered so much, it helps to look at how differently they grew up. Sammo Hung began his training as a small child, entering a demanding opera school in Hong Kong, where discipline was absolute and free time barely existed. Life at the school revolved around endless physical drills, acrobatics, and stage combat, all taught under a strict master whose methods left no room for excuses. Mistakes were corrected instantly and physically, and that environment taught Sammo from a very young age how to endure pain without showing it. He rose quickly within the group of students, eventually becoming the eldest and most respected among them, a group that would later become famous in Hong Kong cinema, as they grew into stunt performers and stars in their own right, including a young Jackie Chan. Sammo became known among his peers as someone who looked out for the younger boys, often sharing whatever small amount of money he earned from early film work, so the group would not go hungry after brutal training sessions. That sense of responsibility followed him into adulthood, shaping him into a natural leader on film sets well before he turned 20. Bruce Lee's early years could not have looked more different. As a teenager in Hong Kong, he was known less for discipline and more for restlessness, spending time in street fights and running with a rougher crowd than most families would have approved of. After one particularly serious rooftop confrontation drew police attention, his parents decided he needed structure, and he began training under the well-known Wing Chun teacher Yip Man. Even then, his rebellious streak did not fully settle, and eventually his family made the decision to send him to the United States, hoping a fresh start abroad might help him grow into the kind of man they knew he could become. 2 boys shaped by opposite worlds, one raised inside rigid discipline, the other raised by the unpredictable streets, were on separate paths that would eventually collide on a film set in the early 1970s. That collision happened in 1971, when Bruce Lee returned to Hong Kong to work with Golden Harvest on what would soon become one of the most influential martial arts films ever made. At the same time, Sammo was already carving out a solid reputation of his own on those same sets, working as a stuntman and fight coordinator known for his sharp eye and physical toughness. Naturally, word had spread quickly about this new arrival from America, whose speed people described as almost impossible to see with the naked eye. Curious rather than threatened, Sammo approached Lee one afternoon between takes and simply asked him whether the stories about his speed were actually true. It was a direct question, the kind that could easily have been taken as a challenge, but Lee reportedly smiled and offered to show him rather than just talk about it. According to the story Sammo has told over the years, he assumed they would do a slow, controlled demonstration, giving him time to react and block. Instead, before he could fully raise his hands, Lee's foot stopped just inches from his face, faster than Sammo had time to process. Rather than reacting with anger or wounded pride, Sammo has said he simply laughed, genuinely impressed, and told Lee exactly that. What could have become an ego-driven standoff turned instead into the beginning of a real friendship, one built on respect for each other's skill rather than any need to prove dominance. That mutual respect grew quickly once they started working together more closely. One story Sammo has shared involves the nunchaku, the weapon most associated with Lee's on-screen image. According to Sammo, he had never trained with the weapon before watching Lee use it on set, but instead of asking for a formal lesson, he simply studied Lee's hand and wrist movements quietly while filming was happening around them. Afterward, he went home, picked up a pair of wooden sticks in his own backyard, and practiced on his own for roughly half an hour until he had worked out the basic mechanics, well enough to demonstrate them convincingly to others. When he later showed the movement to a younger actor, the actor assumed it must have taken years of dedicated practice, and was stunned to learn it had taken Sammo only a single evening of self-directed effort. It is a small story, but it says a lot about both of them. Sammo's sharp instinct for physical learning, and the quiet admiration he clearly held for a friend he considered a genuine master of his craft. That closeness is also part of why Lee made sure Sammo had a role in his biggest international project, the 1973 film that introduced him to audiences around the world. In the opening scene, set in a temple courtyard, Sammo appears as the young monk who spars with Lee before the story truly begins. Watching that scene today, more than 50 years later, it is striking how modern it still looks. Both performers wore small, open-fingered padded gloves and simple dark shorts, a look far removed from the flowing robes typically seen in kung fu films of that era, and one that looks strikingly close to modern mixed martial arts gear. The fight itself ends not with a dramatic strike, but with a tight, grappling submission, a detail borrowed from judo that was almost unheard of in mainstream action cinema at the time. Many fans and historians now point to this brief sequence as one of the earliest times mixed martial arts concepts appeared on the big screen, years before the sport gained mainstream popularity. What makes the scene even more remarkable is how little formal preparation went into it. By Sammo's own account, the two of them did not run through extensive rehearsals in the days leading up to filming. Instead, on the day of the shoot, they sat together, talked through the sequence of moves for a short while, and then filmed it in a single take, an extraordinary feat for choreography that complex. That kind of trust does not come from a rivalry. It comes from two performers who had spent real time learning each other's rhythm, timing, and instincts. Sammo has also described how Lee's demeanor shifted the moment the cameras stopped rolling. On set, Lee had a reputation for being intense and exacting, someone who pushed everyone, including himself, toward perfection. But between takes, around people he trusted, he reportedly became much more relaxed, quick to joke around and spend time with the crew. Watching Lee work that closely, planning camera angles and timing every strike for maximum impact, left a lasting impression on Sammo, one that would go on to shape his own approach to action choreography for the rest of his career. Behind the scenes of that success, though, Lee was also carrying real frustration from years spent trying to break into the American entertainment industry. Before achieving stardom in Hong Kong, he had pursued the lead role in an American television series about a wandering Shaolin monk, a part he felt was practically written for him. Ultimately, the studio chose a different direction, casting an actor without a martial arts background instead, a decision widely understood at the time to reflect the industry's reluctance to put an Asian lead in front of American audiences. That rejection stayed with Lee, and it played a significant role in his decision to stop waiting for opportunities in Hollywood and instead build something of his own. He partnered with Golden Harvest's Raymond Chow to establish his own production company, giving him creative control he had never been offered in the United States. Around the same period, he also chose to close the martial arts schools he had run in America, even though they were thriving, because he did not want his personal philosophy to be turned into a rigid, commercialized system. He preferred to keep teaching small groups privately, on his own terms. Sammo has spoken about watching his friend navigate all of this pressure, the drive to prove himself on a global stage, and how much that pressure seemed to weigh on him even as his career reached new heights. That pressure and momentum came to a sudden and devastating halt on July 20th, 1973, when Bruce Lee died unexpectedly at just 32 years old. The official cause of death was attributed to a sudden brain swelling. His death came only weeks before the release of the film that would go on to cement his legacy worldwide, meaning he never got to see the full scale of the impact that project would have. The news shook the international film community, and Sammo has described that period as one of genuine, deep grief, the loss of a close friend who still had so much creative work left to do. In the aftermath, Golden Harvest was left with a significant amount of unfinished footage from a personal project Lee had been developing. Rather than shelve it, the studio brought in director Robert Klaus to complete the film, and Sammo was brought on as action director to help finish the choreography. It was an emotionally difficult undertaking, relying on stand-ins, careful editing, and existing footage to complete scenes for a friend who was no longer there to perform them. The finished film was eventually released years later. For Sammo, it was never about the paycheck or the credit. By his own account, he felt a personal responsibility to help make sure his friend's final creative vision reached audiences the way Lee had intended. Today, at 74, Sammo Hung is one of the very few people left alive who actually knew Bruce Lee as a real person rather than as an icon frozen on a movie poster. In the decades since, Sammo has built an extraordinary career of his own as an actor, director, and one of the most influential action choreographers in film history, contributing to major projects, including work on the modern Ip Man series. Even now, he continues to appear in action films, still moving with a speed and precision that defies his age. In interview after interview, he keeps returning to the subject of Bruce Lee, not because he is asked to, but because he seems to feel a genuine responsibility to correct the record. He wants younger fans, who mostly know Lee through grainy footage and a handful of iconic scenes, to understand that the man behind those scenes was also warm, funny, endlessly curious, and deeply thoughtful about his craft, not just the fierce screen presence people remember from film clips. For Sammo, telling these stories now is less about nostalgia and more about setting the record straight. The old rumors of a bitter rivalry, of a violent backstage confrontation between two proud fighters, simply do not match what he experienced firsthand. What he describes instead is something much more human. Two young men from completely different backgrounds who found real respect for each other's talent, who pushed one another to get better, and who built a friendship strong enough to survive being tested on camera in front of the entire world. As the years pass, fewer and fewer people remain who can speak to what Bruce Lee was actually like off camera, which makes Sammo's willingness to share these memories increasingly valuable, not just as personal recollection, but as a small, important correction to a story that had been misunderstood for far too long. So here's a question worth sitting with. If the biggest rumor about two legends turned out to be almost entirely wrong, how many other stories we've accepted as fact about our favorite icons might deserve a second look? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you enjoyed learning the real story behind this friendship, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more.